This is a video on the passive voice. You might find it helpful to watch the video on the anatomy of a sentence, the word order of a statement first. But let's get started. Here is a typical sentence, and a typical sentence that follows a typical word order. We have a subject, a verb, and in this case an object. Now, that's one way of classifying the elements of a sentence. Another way to classify them are the agent, the verb, and the recipient. The agent is the actor, the doer, the one responsible for the action taking place. So without the agent, there is no verb. The recipient is what receives the action, is what's acted upon. In this case, the writing happens to the play, Romeo and Juliet. Now when I have this order, agent, verb, recipient, this is what's known as the active voice, and it's sort of a standard for word order and verb structure in most English sentences are said in the active voice. Now we do have a lot of passive sentences as well, and we're going to see that now. Here's an example. Same elements, but in a slightly different order. Is probably the first thing you'll notice is the position. We have now the recipient is in the subject position, and the agent is now at the end of the sentence. That's not all. We also have quite a different change. The verb has taken a new form. So we have this order now. And when I have this order, this is known as the passive voice. Something else to take note of is the addition of this word in front of the agent. It's not the only word. By is the most common for sure. When I'm identifying the agent in the passive voice, the most common word is by, but there are other prepositions that can come before the agent in a passive sentence. Another noteworthy element, noteworthy change is the verb. We've gone from wrote to was written. And what happens in the passive is we have to add the verb to be to the past participle of whatever the verb we're using, the main verb. And if the verb tense in the active is the simple past, then that's the form that the verb to be takes. It's always going to take the tense change and not the main verb. The main verb will always be the past participle, written. The tense occurs in the verb to be. Okay, so why do we use the passive voice? You probably have seen it in many places. It appears a lot in scholarly articles. It's on the news, you'll hear it a lot. But the main reason that it's used is focus of elements of the sentence. So let's look at a few active sentences first. Here are two active sentences. And naturally, when an active sentence is said, the listener immediately focuses on the agent. This becomes, assuming we're not putting special stress on one of these words, this becomes the most essential word in the sentence, and the sentence is about who. Who uses the communicative approach? Our institute, and that's what we're focusing on. The second one, we're focusing on the word someone, and this is a little bit weird actually. This sentence sounds a little bit better in the passive because we don't know this person. So let's make these sentences passive. Now, in the first sentence, the focus is different. The focus is shifted to the recipient. The communicative approach is used here, and we're answering the question, what approach? Which approach are you using here? That's the more important element now. And in the second, so we have a focus here on the recipient, not on the agent. In the second sentence, my house was broken into. Well, what's really important is that it was broken into. This thing happened. This terrible thing happened to my house. So now the focus is on the action. So the main two reasons that we use the passive voice instead of the active voice is to put focus on the recipient or to put focus on the action. And as I said before, this second sentence, my house was broken into, actually sounds a lot better in the passive than the active, because we have no idea who. You might notice that I'm not using by and the agent. I'm not saying my house was broken into by someone. And there's a very good reason why we might omit the agent. Let's take a look at that. So here I have in the active sentence someone, the agent, and in the passive sentence I do not identify them. Now, like I just said, I could. I'll put it in there. But it sounds a little strange. Why would I say this when it just sounds better not to? So there are three main reasons why we choose to omit the agent. And the first one is when the agent is obvious. So you look at these three examples, it's not necessary to say who or what caused these actions to happen to these recipients. For example, English is spoken in this country by the people who live in this country. It would be completely redundant to say that. Same thing with the second example, by people, by the people who live then. The last example is an interesting one. Many people don't realize that the expression was or were born is a passive voice, and it's derived from the verb to bear children. It would sound ridiculous to any native speaker to say, Lana was born by her mother. Obviously, that's where we all come from, so this is a great example where the agent is obvious. The second reason why we might omit the agent is that it's unknown. Like the first example about my house being broken into, similar thing here. My computer has been hacked, obviously by a hacker, but I don't know who the hacker is. Could be someone I know, could be a mysterious person. It's unknown. Same thing with the restaurant. Probably a construction company is building it, or a large organization, maybe a private contractor. I don't know. It's just being built. And the third example is the same as well. And the final reason is kind of related to the first two, is that the agent is not important. Maybe we know, maybe we don't, but this is where the focus is on, the real focus is on the action, or the real focus is on the recipient, and that's all that matters. For example, problem has been fixed, I don't care by whom, it's just done. And that's what matters. And the same thing could be said about these other two examples as well. We're more interested in the result and not who's causing these things to happen. Now, the last thing we're going to discuss are different types of passives. And we're going to start with what's called the eventive passive. It's also known as the dynamic passive. Eventive passives are what they sound like. They describe events. Usually we're talking about something that happened before now. You could use the eventive passive in the present or the future as well, but these examples happen to be in the past. But they describe definite actions that occur and the results on the recipients. Compare this with the stative passive, also known as the static passive. And probably the first thing you'll notice is where the verbs changed here. Now, it's usually when you're comparing these side by side, you'll have an eventive passive is in the past and the stative passive is in the present. It doesn't have to be in the present, like in the second examples here. But what the stative passive describes is the current condition of the recipient. The current condition of the recipient as a result of an event. So because Terry's car was impounded, it now is impounded. Because all the chairs had been taken, when we got there, we saw all the chairs were taken. So usually the stative passive is going to be 1/10 ahead of the eventive passive, if you're comparing them like this. But just as a basic definition, the stative or static passive is describing the results and not the event. Now you can compare the stative passive to the adjectival passive. And technically, adjectival is not a passive. These are actually just adjectives. They're not based on actual actions. They're just adjectives. They describe the subject, or they describe a noun. And this happens because these words, which are past participles, but they're adjectives derived from verbs. And you might think, well, what's the difference? It looks exactly like the stative passive. That's in some ways it's difficult to tell the difference between an adjectival passive and a stative passive. But there are two big differences. And the first one is these adjectives, there's no agent. Generally, I mean, Terry wasn't frustrated by the police. He was frustrated because of the situation. But like I said, you can compare a stative passive to an eventive passive, and Terry's car is impounded by the police because it was impounded by the police. But he's just frustrated. It's just how he feels. It's like saying Terry is angry. It's just an adjective. So that's one way that we can see the difference between an adjective and a stative passive. The other thing is like any adjective, you're not limited to using the verb to be to connect the adjective to the noun. You can use any linking verb. For example, looked or appeared, seemed, looked like. We can also use get, become, words like these, linking verbs which connect the noun to the complement. You cannot really use these words in the stative passive. I can't say Terry's car seemed impounded. Well, that would be an adjective and not a passive. Just as a note here, we do use the verb to get in passives, but usually the eventive passive. So I'm going to use get in those first two examples in the red box. Let's replace those. And that's fine. Some people will tell you that this is grammatically incorrect to use get instead of be. It's not so much incorrect as just very informal English. It's more formal, or quote-unquote more correct, to use the verb to be in the eventive passive. The final type of passives are causatives. And causatives are special verbs. They can be active or passive. They're verbs that describe how the subject makes another subject do an action, usually used for services. Like in this first example, Terry got his car towed by Bob's towing service. He hired someone to tow his car. What's important to note about causative passives is they generally they can't use the verb to be. I can't say Terry is his car towed, or was his car towed. I have to use get or have for these verbs. Always get or have. And that works the same in active sentences with the causative as well. We usually use those verbs. There are a few other verbs as well. But in causative passives, it's almost always get and have. I'm not going to get into the specific changes that verbs take from active to passive, because there's a lot of verb tenses and all the modals, but I recommend you read that section in the Grammar Goodies, because it's something that you'll need to know pretty much inside out when you're teaching the passive to your students.